Nammo Phat. Good morning. Thank you for joining me for our daily practice check-in. Listen, listen, listen. This beautiful sound calls us back to our true home. The fourth mindfulness training. Aware of the suffering caused by unmindful speech, the inability to listen to others, I vow to cultivate loving speech and deep listening in order to bring joy and happiness to others and to relieve others of their suffering. Knowing that words can create happiness or suffering, I'm determined to speak truthfully with words that inspire self-confidence, joy, and hope. I will not spread news that I do not know to be certain, and will not criticize or condemn things of which I am not sure. I'll refrain from uttering words that can cause division or discord, or that can cause the family or the community to break. I am determined to make all efforts to reconcile and resolve all conflicts, however small. We're continuing to read Ajahn Thanissaro's essay on perennial philosophy from his book, The Karma of Questions. Perennial philosophers have used two tactics to get around this difficulty. One is to cite the Pali texts, but to reinterpret them. The teaching on not-self, they say, is simply an indirect way of approaching the basic tenet of perennial philosophy. If one abandons one's identification with the aggregates of the small self, one awakens to one's identity with the larger self, the oneness of the all. Even though the awakening account makes no mention of a larger self or of any feelings of oneness, the perennial philosophers assume by extrapolation from accounts in other traditions that they must have been present in the Buddha's experience, and that either he neglected to mention them or his followers dropped them from their records. The problem here is that the Pali Canon assigns feelings of oneness and non-duality to mundane levels of concentration, and not to the transcendent. And it also lumps views of an infinite self with views of a finite self as equally untenable. In fact, the Majjhima Nikaya 22 singles out the idea of an eternal self at one with the cosmos as utterly and completely the teaching of a fool. And even though the Pali Canon admits that its description of the Buddha's awakening is incomplete, there is no reason to believe that the unexpressed essence of his awakening would be expressed in a tenet that he explicitly said to abandon. This difficulty has led to a second tactic for dealing with the problem of the Pali Canon, to dismiss it entirely in favor of Mahayana texts that fit better with the tenets of perennial philosophy. Rather than treating Theravada Buddhism as a complete tradition with its own integrity, perennial philosophers adopt the Mahayana polemical stance that Theravada is simply an incomplete, Huxley called it primitive, fragment of a tradition that finds its explicit completion only in the Mahayana itself. The perennial philosophers' reason for adopting this stance relate to the second way in which they delimit the meaning of great religious tradition. The implicit value claim that non-dualism is superior to dualism or pluralism. The superiority of non-dualism, they say, is both conceptual and ethical. Conceptually, it's more inclusive, encompassing a larger view. The erasing of distinctions is superior to the creation of distinctions. Ethically, non-dualism leads to acts of kindness and compassion. When people see their essential oneness, they are more likely to treat one another with the same care they would treat themselves. Thus, the great religious traditions must, by definition, be non-dualistic. Both the conceptual and the ethical arguments for non-dualism, however, are open to question. Conceptually, there's no proof that a non-dual view is necessarily more encompassing than a dual or pluralistic one. A person who has had a direct experience of duality may have touched something that lies outside the oneness comprehended by the non-dualist. The Pali interpretation of Nibbana is an example. Nibbana lies outside the oneness of jhana, and even the allness of the all, the entire range of the six senses, including the mind, and their objects. It neither includes them nor acts as their ground or source. Passages that cite the deathless as the ground of all things are mistranslations. At the same time, there are many areas of life in which distinctions are clearly superior to a lack of distinctions. When you need brain surgery, you want a doctor who is clear about the distinction between skillful and unskillful methods. A person who sees distinctions may be detecting subtle differences that a non-dualist simply hasn't noticed. Ethically, the superiority of non-dualism is even harder to prove. To begin with, the notion of ethical superiority is in and of itself a dualistic position. If compassion is better than cruelty, there has to be a distinction between the two. Secondly, there's the problem of theodicy, the explanation for the source of evil in a just universe. If all things come from one source, then where does evil come from? One common non-dualist answer is that it comes from ignorance of our essential oneness. But that simply drives the question back another step. Where does ignorance come from, if not from the one source? How can the one source be ignorant of itself? Is it incompetent? Is it playing an inhumane game of hide and seek? The issue of theodicy has been argued repeatedly over the ages in every tradition that posits a single source for the cosmos, and the non-dualist answers eventually come down to three. Evil is either illusory, or necessary, or both. But if you can say that evil is illusory, it's a sign that you've never been victimized by evil. If you say that it's necessary, then what incentive is there for people not to do it? Those who want to do evil can simply say that they're performing a necessary function in the world. The point is illustrated by Indian legend of the murderer who met a philosophical non-dualist on the road and challenged him to give one reason consistent with his philosophy for why he shouldn't allow himself to be stabbed. The non-dualist was unable to do so, and so met with his death. Thus it's apparent that the fact claim of perennial philosophy, that it is giving voice to the essential message of all the world's great religious traditions, depends on a very restricted definition of all. The great religious traditions are by definition those who agree with its principles. Those who don't are lesser traditions and so may be discounted. This means that the perennial philosopher's comments about all great religions are not simple observations about a range of phenomena whose boundaries are already widely accepted. Instead, they're an attempt to define those boundaries, and a very exclusionary one at that. There's no way that such a restricted vision of the world's religious traditions could provide a rallying point that would unite them in peace and harmony. It simply adds one more divisive voice to the clamor. May all beings be well. May all beings be happy. May all beings be peaceful. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Thank you for joining me this morning.